Which subtraction? One should always be attentive when opponents start to talk the same language, to share a premise. This shared point is, as a rule, their symptomal point. Let us take three contemporary philosophers as different as Badiou, Critchley, and Negri. As we have seen, they shared the premise that the era of party-state politics, in which the ultimate aim is to take control of the state apparatus, is over. From now on, politics should subtract itself from the domain of the state, creating spaces outside, sites of resistance. The obverse of this shift is the acceptance of capitalism as the background of our lives. The lesson of the fall of communist states is that it is meaningless to fight capitalism. It is from this shared space that one should subtract oneself. Resistance presents itself as an exodus, as a departure outside the world. In a recent interview, Alain Badiou exposed the core of his political diagnosis of our predicament. He starts by drawing a line of distinction between communism and Marxism. He still considers himself a communist. Communism in the generic sense simply means that everyone is equal to everyone else within the multiplicity and diversity of social functions. Marxism, however, is something else. The core of Marxism is what Lenin called the ABC of communism. The masses are divided into classes, the classes are represented by parties, and the parties directed by leaders. This is what no longer holds today. The disorganized masses of global capitalism are no longer divided into classes in the classical Marxist fashion. So while the task still is to organize the masses politically, it can no longer be done in the old class party manner. The model of centralized party made possible a new form of power that was nothing less than the power of the party itself. We are now at what I call a distance from the state. This is first of all because the question of power is no longer immediate. Nowhere does a taking power in the insurrectional sense seem possible today. 3 points are to be noted here. First, the ambiguous definition of communism. Equality within the multiplicity and diversity of social functions. What this definition avoids is the inequality generated by the very multiplicity and diversity of social functions. Second, the notion of class antagonism as simply the masses divided into classes reduces it to a subdivision within the social body, ignoring its status as a cut that runs across the entire social body. Third, what is the exact status of the impossibility of a revolutionary seizure of power? Is this a mere temporary setback, a sign that we live in a non-revolutionary situation, or does it indicate the limitation of the party-state model of revolution? Badiou opts for the second version. In this new situation, we need a new form of politics, the politics of subtraction. Political processes that are independent of, subtracted from, the power of the state. Unlike the insurrectional form of the party, this politics of subtraction is no longer immediately destructive, antagonistic, or militarized. How are we to think this externality with regard to state? Badiou proposes here his key conceptual distinction, that between destruction and subtraction. A subtraction is no longer dependent on the dominant laws of the political reality of a situation. It is irreducible, however, to the destruction of these laws as well. A subtraction might leave the laws of the situation still being in place. What subtraction does is bring about a point of autonomy. It's a negation, but it cannot be identified with the properly destructive part of negation. We need an originary subtraction capable of creating a new space of independence and autonomy from the dominant laws of the situation. The underlying philosophical category that Badiou problematizes here is the Hegelian notion of determinate negation, of a negation, destruction, whose result is not zero. Contrary to Hegel, for whom the negation of the negation produces a new affirmation, I think we must assert that today negativity, properly speaking, does not create anything new. It destroys the old, of course, but does not give rise to a new creation. Crucial is this link between revolutionary politics and Hegelian dialectics. Just as the party, which was once the victorious form of insurrection, is today outdated, so too is the dialectical theory of negation. Unfortunately, this leads Badiou to a pseudo-problem of adjustment or calibration between the properly negative part of negation and the part I called subtractive. What I call a weak negation, the reduction of politics to democratic opposition, can be understood as a subtraction that has become so detached from destructive negation that it can no longer be distinguished from what Habermas calls consensus. On the other hand, we are also witnessing a desperate attempt to maintain destruction as a pure figure of creation and the new. This symptom often has a religious and nihilistic dimension. In short, the task is to find a proper measure between democratic pure subtraction, deprived of its destructive potential, and a purely destructive terrorist negation. The problem here is that this internal disjunction of negation into its destructive and subtractive aspects exactly reproduces the disjunction to which the Hegelian notion of determinate negation tried to provide a solution. Badiou is well aware that one should not renounce violence. One should rather reconceptualize it as defensive violence, a defense of the autonomous space created by subtraction, like the Zapatistas defending their liberated territory. The example of this proper measure provided by Badiou raises more questions than it answers. That of the Solidarity movement in Poland, which practiced a new dialectic between the means of actions that were classically understood to be negative, the strike, demonstrations, and so on, and something like the creation of a space of autonomy in the factories. The objective was not to take power, to replace an existing power, but to force the state to invent a new relation with the workers. However, the reason why this experiment was so brief, as Badiou himself notes, is that it clearly functioned as the second phase in the three phases of dissidence. 1. Criticizing the regime on its own terms. We want true socialism. That is, the reproach of the ruling party is, you betrayed your own socialist roots. 2. To the counter-approach of the ruling party that this adherence to socialism is hypocritical, follows the open admission. Yes, we are outside the scope of the ruling socialist ideology, but we do not want power, just our autonomy. Plus, our demand is that those in power respect certain elementary ethical rules, human rights, etc. 3. To the reproach of the ruling party that this lack of interest in taking power is hypocritical, that the dissidents really want power, follows the open admission. Yes, why not? We want power. Badiou's other example, that of Hezbollah in Lebanon, with its ambiguous relation to state power, participating in it while retaining a distance towards it, resuscitating something like the old Leninist notion of dual power, which was for Lenin also a temporary tactic, laying ground for the later full takeover, gives rise to a further problem, the religious foundation of these movements. Badiou makes the point that there is an internal limitation to these movements, bound as they are to religious particularity. Is, however, this limitation only a short-term one, as Badiou seems to imply, something that these movements will have to overcome in the proverbial second higher stage of their development, when they will have to universalize themselves. Badiou is right to note that the problem here is not religion as such, but its particularity. And is this particularity not now a fatal limitation of these movements, whose ideology takes a directly counter-Enlightenment form? The adequate reply to Badiou's version of Bartleby politics should be the Hegelian one. The whole problem of proper measure is a false one. Subtraction is the negation of negation, or determinate negation. In other words, instead of directly negating, destroying the ruling power, remaining within its field, it undermines this very field, opening up a new positive space. The point is that there are subtractions and subtractions. Badiou himself commits a symptomatic conceptual regression when he qualifies the social democratic position as a pure subtraction. The democratic subtraction is no subtraction at all. It is rather the nihilist terrorists who subtract, creating their space of fundamentalist religious identity. In them, radical destruction overlaps with radical subtraction. Another pure subtraction is New Age meditative withdrawal, which creates a space of its own while leaving the sphere of social reality the way it is. There is also pure destruction, the outbursts of meaningless violence like the burning of the cars in the French banlieue of 2005. So when is subtraction really creative of a new space? The only appropriate answer, when it undermines the coordinates of the very system from which it subtracts itself, striking at the point of its symptomal torsion. Imagine the proverbial house of cards or a pile of wooden pieces which rely on one another in such a complex way that if one single card or piece of wood is pulled out, subtracted, the whole edifice collapses. This is the true art of subtraction. Recall the plot of Saramago's Seeing, in which voters massively refuse to vote and cast invalid ballots, throwing the entire political establishment, the ruling bloc and the opposition, into panic. This act put them in a situation of radical responsibility towards their subject. Such an act is subtraction at its purest, a mere gesture of withdrawing from participation in a legitimizing ritual makes state power appear as if suspended in the air above the precipice. Their acts no longer covered by democratic legitimization, those in power are all of a sudden deprived of the option of replying to the protesters, "Who are you to criticize us? We are an elected government, we can do what we want." Lacking legitimacy, they have to earn it the hard way, by their deeds. I remember the last years of communist rule in Slovenia. There was no government so eager to earn its legitimacy and do something for the people, trying to please everyone, precisely because the communists held power, which, as everyone including themselves knew, was not democratically legitimized. Since the communists knew that their end was approaching, they knew they would be harshly judged. There is an obvious reproach that arises here. Is this not the case already today, with the growing indifference and abstention of voters? Those in power feel no threat in these phenomena, so where is the subversive edge here? The answer is that one should focus on the big other. The majority of those who do not vote do it not as an active gesture of protest, but in the mode of relying on others. I do not vote, but I count on others to vote in my place. Non-voting becomes an act when it affects the big other. In this precise sense, subtraction already is the Hegelian negation of the negation. The first negation is a direct destruction. It violently negates, destroys the positive content that it opposes within the same shared field of reality. A subtraction proper, on the contrary, changes the coordinates of the field itself, within which the struggle is taking place. In some of Badiou's formulations, this crucial point gets lost. Peter Hallward has drawn attention to the multiplicity of meanings of Badiouian subtraction, as if this notion covers a Wittgensteinian family of meanings. The main axis is between subtraction as withdrawing from the domain of state, creating a space of one's own, and subtraction as reduction to minimal difference, moving from multiplicity to basic antagonism, and thus drawing the real line of separation. The difficult task is to make a move in which these two dimensions overlap. The subtraction to be made is one from the hegemonic field, which, simultaneously, forcefully intervenes into this field, reducing it to its occluded minimal difference. Such a subtraction is extremely violent, even more violent than destruction, purification. It is a reduction to minimal difference, to a difference of parts, no part, one and zero, groups, and the proletariat. It is not only a subtraction of the subject from the hegemonic field, but a subtraction which violently affects this field itself, laying bare its true coordinates. Such a subtraction does not add a third position to the two positions whose tension characterizes the hegemonic field. So that we have now, on the top of liberalism and fundamentalism, also radical leftist emancipatory politics. This third term rather denaturalizes the whole hegemonic field, bringing out the underlying complicity of the opposed poles that constitute it. Take Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The hegemonic opposition is there the one between Capulets and Montagues. It is the opposition in the positive order of being, a stupid issue of belonging to a particular this or that family clan. To make this issue into a minimal difference, to subordinate all other choices to this one as the only choice that really matters, is the wrong move. Romeo and Juliet's gesture with regard to this hegemonic opposition is precisely that of subtraction. Their love singularizes them. They subtract themselves from its hold, constituting their own space of love, which, the moment it is practiced as marriage, not merely as a transgressive secret affair, perturbs the hegemonic opposition. The crucial thing to take note of here is that such a subtractive gesture on behalf of love works only with regard to the substantive differences of particular ethnic, religious domains, not with regard to class differences. Class differences are non-subtractive. One cannot subtract from them because they are not differences between particular regions of social being, but cut across the entire social space. When confronted with a class difference, there are only two solutions to the love bond. Namely, the couple has to take sides. Either the lower class partner is graciously accepted into the higher class, or the higher class partner renounces his or her class in a political gesture of solidarity with the subaltern class. Therein resides the dilemma of subtraction. Is it a subtraction withdrawal, which leaves the field from which it withdraws intact, or even functions as its inherent supplement, like the subtraction from social reality to one's true self proposed by New Age meditation? Or does it violently shake up the field from which it withdraws? The first subtraction fits post-political biopolitics perfectly. What then would be the opposite of biopolitics?